Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. I've been away for a few weeks. I've had allergies and stuff like that, so I didn't want to keep sneezing into the camera. But I wanted to catch up because I've been doing a lot of reading in the bathtub. Even when I'm not doing these lectures, I'm still reading in the bathtub. I never take a break from my appointed mission in life. And I thought one of the things I wanted to do over the next, you know, several years, I hope decades of my life, is in reading. One of the things about the bathtub that's important and just pleasurable reading is to avoid systematic pursuits. So we can reading Ulysses in the bathtub was not the high point of this series to my mind, and it's not really useful to read, say, every Nabokov novel over the course of 3 months in the bathtub because it becomes work. To enjoy the books, we need two things. We need variety and repetition. So we need to change things up and move around and try different writers and go try a science fiction book and then maybe a mystery novel and then some literature and then some poetry. We throw something in, just change our expectations. Because if you read the same writer, even your favorite writers, day after day after day, it can get unsurprising. So one of the things I thought I would try to do over the next few years is we talked about William Trevor and Brian Moore over the past few episodes. And I'll show you some of the stuff I've got here. Now, William Trevor, we talked about in conjunction with his last short story collection, Last Stories, a wonderful book. He was also a novelist. He wrote a novel in between almost every short story collection. And I have not read a lot of the novels. In fact, I've only read one of them, which I liked. And it was sort of like a long short story, but it was a very good story called The Story of Lucy Galt. I read this when it came out maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And I had read Love and Summer at a bad time in my life when I couldn't concentrate. And I liked it, but I couldn't remember it very well. And I thought what I would like to do is kind of go backwards. I now have all of Trevor's novels. And I wanted to read his novels in reverse chronological order for no real reason except that I find his late books really interesting and kind of slightly murky and slightly impressionistic. They're not really sharp, clear writing as some of his early short stories were. And I just wanted to kind of work my way back into his many novels, through his many novels. And I started with Love and Summer, and I'm working my way backwards through his novels. And I want to say a few words about those books tonight. I thought at the same time, because he's a very different writer, they're both Irish, but there's no real other connections between the two writers. There's Brian Moore's novels, who I've always loved, and who is a great novelist. I've read many of his books so many times. I've read them over and over again over the decades, and he almost never puts a foot wrong. Almost every time I read one of his books, I enjoy it. And I thought we would look at some of these. I won't read these again right now or in any sort of order because I've read them so many times. But we could look kind of at these two writers who, over many decades, wrote nothing but good books, right up to the end of their lives. So you really can't say that there was a certain period of their life that was better than any others. And while their prose and their ideas and their approaches to the novel changes, from what I can tell, they are always good. So I thought we could just talk about them and maybe suggest some books for you to read. So let's start by thinking about the last novels written by Trevor and Moore. Trevor's last novel was called Love and Summer, and Brian Moore's last novel was called The Magician's Wife. I'll say a couple of brief things about this book. First of all, when I read it, it wasn't my favorite Brian Moore novel the first time I read it. It's an odd book for him. And it's the last novel he writes. To describe a very summary career, he starts off writing these kind of literary novels about kind of lost, lonely people in Belfast, his first two novels. And he works his way through a career in which he starts writing kind of almost science fiction-y, fantasy, ghost stories. He does a few of those, some sort of surrealistic novels such as the Great Victorian Collection, or his one about the a woman who cites the Virgin Mary, and these are kind of fantastic novels. And then he does sort of thrillers, political thrillers, and after several political thrillers, he writes this last novel. Again, it wasn't intended to be his last novel, called The Magician's Wife, which is set in 1850s, and the premise is quite odd. It's about a magician in France who's hired to go to Algeria to perform magic tricks and to pretend he is a powerful representative of the French government and to aid the French in negotiating settlements with the Algerian tribal leaders. Now, it's a very strange book. The prose is very different from Brian Moore's other work. It's a much richer, it's a little more lavish. The opening section is one of my favorite book passages by Brian Moore, which is a visit to this magician's home in the outskirts, in the countryside of France, where he keeps these large mechanical creatures, and it's almost a fantasy section, and it's a mix of kind of Flaubert and kind of de Maupassant, kind of macabre vision of this place in the magician's home. And then after that wonderful opening, which was probably the reason I didn't like the book the first time I read it, we go to Algeria, and we get involved in this kind of political game that the magician's playing in Algeria with the aid of the French government. Now, the first time I read it, I thought I was a little disappointed because I wanted to stay in this magical world of the magician's home. And in rereading this book last year, I think the book just works perfect. It's a wonderful historical fantasy, not fantasy, but adventure, political adventure, and it's told through the eyes of the wife of the magician, which is a perfect Brian Moore idea. So I won't tell you more than that, but just to say, at the end of his career, he's working on another book after this about Rimbaud. But this is an amazing and beautiful book, and really worth trying because it's very different from Moore's other books. Let's just quite quickly summarize his previous books to this. His penultimate book was The Statement. This is the book he's still best known by, and it's interesting in that it is, like all of Brian Moore's books, I feel experimental. He does something in this book he doesn't normally do. In The Magician's Wife, like most of his books, he starts with one point of view, which is the point of view of the magician's wife, and he pretty much stays with her throughout the book. He doesn't go popping all over the place. In his third to last novel, Northern Life, it's told from the viewpoint of a religious figure who is in a kind of a Haiti type world where he's also watching some political intrigues, and we stay with his point of view all the way through. In this penultimate novel, which was his most successful book and is a great page-turning thriller, he tries something a little different, which is he changes point of view almost every 4 or 5 pages. It's very unusual for Moore, who is very interested in one person's perception of the world and what happens to that person. But in this one, he's trying to write about the various ways the French and the Catholic hierarchy made deals with the Nazis. It's particularly worth reading today. They all had different ways of rationalizing why they made these deals. And the main point of view in this is the character of this Nazi, who's this former Nazi who was in the French government, who's off hiding 30 years later in France, 40 years later, and he's running around and he's being hidden by the Catholic Church. It's based on a real case. The name of the guy escapes me at the moment, but this guy surfaced in France about 20 years ago. Now, this is a wonderful book, and we need to change points of view because we need to hear all these different ways of looking at this ridiculous, horrible conspiracy within the church. The main point of view is this evil man, and you can't stay in this guy's point of view through the whole way either. So it's a perfectly sensible way of telling the story, and it's a real page-turner. It was his one real big bestseller. So I wanted to say that just to show you that technically Moore may do something different in every book. He's very different from Trevor, who's very similar in his way he structures his novels. He's very similar in the way he approaches the novels, and it doesn't vary a lot over his career. His more will pop around in genres. He'll tell a ghost story like Fergus, and he will try these political thrillers, and he'll do historical novels. And Trevor will pretty much stick with the 70s and the 80s in England and Europe. And while he will actually geographically shift, because he knows lots of different countries and the way different people think and talk, he pretty much stays in that sort of territory. The territory of a range of fairly middle-class people, occasionally these kind of shabby genteel people who's live in these kind of fallen aristocratic mansions, or fairly working-class poor people, or people who are down on their luck, like many of the characters in Love and Summer. Now, Love and Summer is told over the course. This is his last novel, and it's a really good book, really a moving book, like all of Trevor's novels that I've read so far. And I wanted to warn everybody about one thing about Trevor that I still find really strange. Get my glasses. I never use Trevor to teach writing. I never do it. He's one of the writers I like best because I often find him technically very clumsy and annoying, particularly when he starts his stories in his books. I'm going to give you an example of Love and Summer. This is the opening sentence of the book. On a June evening, some years after the middle of the last century, Mrs. Eileen Canulty passed through the town of Rathmoy from number 4 the Square to McGinnis Street into Hurley Lane, along Irish Street, across Cloud Jordan Road to the Church of the Most Holy Redeemer. Her night was spent there. Now, that whole paragraph drives me crazy when I first read it. I don't know who she is. Eventually, I learned fairly quickly that she's actually dead. Then I'm told about all the different people in her family within the second paragraph and how they didn't get along and his daughter wasn't very good. And then we meet all these different characters. Then we see all these different people in the village watching. It's really confusing. No matter how many times I read Trevor, the openings of many of his books just confuse the hell out of me. And so I'm saying this simply to say, well, you've got to bear with it. It often takes a chapter or two for things to settle down. And Trevor's trying to open up a whole community, usually. And in this small town, we're being introduced to a number of people who, after the death of this woman who was kind of the matriarchal character in the village, we are really basically watching about a man who's a stranger, who's alone, who meets a married woman, a young married woman who was an orphan and has been pretty lonely and kind of a sad life, and they have a relationship. And it's about the last summer of their relationship. It's interspersed with the stories of all these people in the village, often who are introduced to the reader as inchoately as sometimes that opening paragraph was. But it's still a lovely book, and I would really try it. His second to last book I read years ago, this is called the Story of Lucy Galt, and it's in Cork. It starts in the time of, I'm just looking at this from the jacket flap, in 1920s. And the premise is one of these kind of portmanteau premises. We just have a kind of an idea, and then it leads to a series of small, brief snapshots of the lives of these characters. It's about a young girl named Lucy Galt who goes off one day as her parents are about to leave. They're selling up their properties. They're some of these fallen old aristocratic family. They're selling their property, and they're going away to Europe for the rest of their lives. And on the day before they are leaving, this little young girl of, what is she? She's very small. She's 8 years old. She goes off and gets lost and falls asleep somewhere, and in the course of that, a body is found on the beach. To make a long story short, the parents think their daughter's dead, and they leave and they move and they go away. And they're so upset they don't read the post, they don't read the news forever. They just go off on this life in Europe, spending the money from their selling of the house. And the girl comes home to the servants and is raised by the servants. And it's kind of a perfect Trevor world, which is a number of people trying to eke out these little small pleasures in a world where all the riches are past. They're all in the past. And it's a lovely, haunting book. I still remember it quite vividly. Finally, in our trip backwards through the careers of these two wonderful writers, Death in Summer. I was sitting in a restaurant 10, 15 years ago with a friend of mine she was a big fan of Trevor. We were both fans of Trevor's. And we saw a woman reading this in paperback at the table. And I'll never forget this. I said, oh, Trevor, is that the new one? He's wonderful, isn't he? And the woman looked at us. She looked up from the book. She was like 5 pages to the end. She said, I can't wait till I finish it. It's so awful. And I thought, well, maybe it wasn't very good. Maybe Trevor wasn't, he's got his problems sometimes. But maybe this one didn't work that well. So I'm just reading this now. It's a wonderful book. It's, again, kind of a guy whose family was sort of wealthy in one time. He sort of inherited this house. And it's about his relationship, particularly with a kind of another one of these lost waifs in Trevor, a woman who was raised in an orphanage, who escaped, who wants to be a babysitter, and she's interested in this man, and she loves his house, and she wants to be a part of it, and he doesn't hire her. And it's about her obsession, the obsession of this girl named Petty, to become part of this world she can't be a part of. And it's a bit macabre, but it's a bit disturbing. It's wonderfully written, and it's wonderfully involving as you get into it. I'm going to read you the opening because it's a horrible opening. Okay, I hate this opening. He starts with funerals a lot. The opening paragraph of Death in Summer by William Trevor, do not hold this against the novel. After the funeral, the hiatus that tragedy brought takes a different form. I hate that opening sentence. I don't know whether it takes it. It's been a hiatus and it's a tragedy. I have no idea what he's talking about. The suddenness of the death has gone irrelevant now. Thaddeus has stood and knelt in the church of St. Nicholas, has heard his wife called good, the word he himself gave to a clergyman he has known all his life. I think there's 3 different periods of time all bound up together. People were present in the church who were strangers to him and who afterwards in the house introduced themselves as a few of Letitia's friends from the time before he knew her. And where is Letitia now? An undertaker a week ago inquired. Now, it's a week ago now. I don't know what's going on in this opening paragraph. Confusing Thaddeus, who for a moment wondered if the man knew why he had been summoned. Why had he been summoned? It's Letitia who has died, he said, and answered when the man explained that Letitia was in the mortuary where she'd been taken. Okay, I've read that 4 times. I don't understand that paragraph. The next paragraph or 2 are incredibly confusing because apparently we're watching the scene through the 2 servants' eyes, whose names is Zenobia, and I forget who the other servant's name is. But basically, a man's wife has died in an accident on the road, and they're burying her. And, we just need to get that established, but it's very confusing where we are. And I think that opening chapter to me, I think I had to get through the entire first chapter before I sort of understood the principal characters. I understood where we were slipping, point of view wise, we were slipping around. And I knew what was happening. And then it's just a beautiful book. But there are these awkwardnesses, particularly setting up scenes and so forth. Moore never wastes a moment. Here's point of view shifts. There's it must be 50, 60 point of view shifts in this book, and they're almost like master classes in how to know where we are, when we are, what's happening, and keeping the sequence of all these different characters moving forward in time. It is the book to read to learn to write, besides learn how to read. And Trevor requires more attention, but his vision and the world of the people he keeps writing about are moving and emotional and unusual. He deals with a kind of odd characters who almost seem imagined and fairly realistic, but often with a kind of a dramatic twist, such as this tragedy of this child, this baby that's becomes involved in this altercation between this man who's lost his wife, and this this lost woman who wants to be a part of his life and wants to be the mother of this child. It's a wonderful book. Okay, so we're going to, over the next few decades, we're going to work our way backwards through these, particularly through the Trevor books. Because I haven't read the novels. This is the first time I've actually read most of his novels. I have not read, and I'm really enjoying them. So you can read along with me, or just go out and read any Brian Moore novels you can find. Okay, the more novels, you can really see a real shift in the way the types of stories he tells. He changes tact quite a few times in his career. Okay,